vanishes without a trace. Police follow mysterious clues to the possible kidnapping or murder. But without a prime suspect or a body, the trail soon turns cold. After more than a decade, a United States attorney with a reputation for cracking unsolved crimes uncovers evidence of a violent and secret world and comes face to face with an elusive criminal. In the fall of 1989, Chicago-based U.S. Attorney Stephen Miller and his team of prosecutors recruited investigators from 3 federal agencies and launched a groundbreaking investigation into the mysterious disappearance of Helen Brock.
She was the wealthiest woman in Illinois. In 1977, when she disappeared, her net worth was estimated north of $40 million. She was very prominent. She was a socialite. She was a philanthropist. She had friends in high places. And typically, people like that don't simply vanish. And at least in the early years after her disappearance, there was enormous law enforcement efforts trying to find out what happened. And the fact that they were unable to do so led to the mystery growing and growing and growing.
It was spring of 1988 at a riding stable in suburban Chicago. Barbara Morris, a wealthy widow, was beginning to realize something was terribly wrong with her new horse. Despite expensive training in the show ring, the horse still refused to jump. Her temper was rising as she began to realize that if this $50,000 animal couldn't compete in the ring, it was worthless to her. She had purchased the horse as an investment on the recommendation of her boyfriend, Richard Bailey. What Barbara Morris didn't know was that most of the women who dated Bailey over the past 15 years had also invested hundreds of thousands of dollars on flawed horses. According to former Assistant U.S. Attorney Ron Safer,
Richard Bailey was a predator of women. What Richard Bailey did was, with his band of thieves, Confederates, they would, at a stables, locate a rich, lonely woman who, and they identified her, they scoped her out, they looked at her house, they looked at her car, and then when they would determine that that was a ripe victim, they sprung the trap.
The next day, Barbara Morris went to the stable, clutching a handful of bills for her expensive horse's inflated upkeep. The stable owner was nowhere to be found. When she received no help from the stable employees, it dawned on her that she might be the victim of a scam.
The trap involved a whole panoply of players. It involved a trainer who could say, this horse is an exceptional horse. You should really purchase this horse. It involved a veterinarian who drugged the horse to make a lame horse appear like a show champion. It involved stable owners. And of course, the center of this scheme was Richard Bailey.
Look, she got good, solid feet.
Barbara next went to her boyfriend, Richard Bailey.
Barbara, how are you? Good to see you. We're just thinking about you.
She told him of her suspicions that the horse was bad and the stables were crooked. Bailey tried in vain to calm her down and distract her.
I was going to ask you out to dinner. Aren't they lovely?
Finally, though he didn't know it, Barbara came to realize that it was Bailey himself who was conning her.
What Richard Bailey did was he took woman after woman, and he would sweep them off their feet. He would pay a tremendous amount of attention to them. He would send them flowers every day, pick them up in his rented Rolls Royce. They, of course, believed it was his. Take them to the finest restaurants in Chicago and gain their confidence.
Miss Morrison, have a seat.
Barbara Morris went to the local police. They told her it was a case for civil courts because a fraudulent horse sale was hard to prove in the criminal system. But one state investigator who had watched Bailey for years was interested. And he took her case to the U.S. Attorney's Office and presented it to the Chief of Special Prosecutions, Steve Miller.
I was told that the man suspected of stealing the $50,000 from this woman was rumored to be a professional con man, and that he had supposedly bilked many people over the years out of money involving transactions with horses. That piqued my curiosity. They also told me that Bailey, the suspect, had been rumored to have dated Helen Brock.
Helen Brock was the richest widow in the state of Illinois 11 years before in 1977. She had assets of over $30 million. Helen Brock had lived with her husband Frank in a large house in suburban Glenview, and they were happily married for over 20 years, until Frank died in 1970. Their fortune came from Frank's ownership of the Brock Candy Company. He had even used Helen's favorite colors, pink and purple, on the signature candy boxes. In 1977, she was reported missing and never seen or heard from again. 7 years later, in 1984, she was declared legally dead. Her disappearance became one of the biggest mysteries in Chicago, the subject of much rumor and folklore, but very little fact. Her case was officially open, but had been cold for over a decade. Given the chance to solve a 13-year mystery, Miller looked into the case. But he knew to solve it, he would have to run an unorthodox murder investigation. One that followed not forensics, but fraud.
Because Richard Bailey had no criminal record, I decided to play a hunch. I'd been told the rumors were he was a professional con man.
Miller sent his team of federal agents to the county courthouses surrounding Chicago to see if Bailey had ever been sued.
The agents really excitedly came back to me, telling me that Richard Bailey had been sued over a 20-year period by many, many women. One a mirror image of the next, detailing fraud after fraud after fraud by Richard Bailey.
But the stacks of civil cases were not enough to start an investigation. They would need a current case and a criminal act. Bailey's latest victim, Barbara Morris, agreed to let prosecutors record her phone conversations with him. This time, he tried to get her to write a check for $100,000 to buy a flawed stallion named Victory Morn. According to investigators, Bailey's fraudulent statements on the phone allowed authorities to open the investigation. Prosecutors needed to understand Bailey's whole criminal enterprise, and they wanted to get solid information on Bailey's connection to the late Helen Brock. One of the investigators was ATF agent Jim DeLorto.
Richard Bailey's relationship with Helen Brock was notorious. Everybody on the north side involved in the horse industry knew that Richard Bailey was wining and dining Helen Brock basically for one reason, to get her money.
Okay, we're now looking for number 127.
The horse business, a symbol of status and refinement on the outside, was in reality an often corrupt world on the inside, with a criminal element thriving in the stables and show rings, according to FBI agent Pete Cullen.
The horse industry in Chicago back in the 1970s and 80s would probably be described as systemic corruption. It was everywhere. It was hard for any person legitimately to buy a horse of true value without being defrauded.
According to investigators, the most corrupt stables were run by the Jane family, nicknamed the Horse Mafia. Investigators say they were a group of brothers, notorious for pulling all kinds of scams on clients, on competitors, and on insurance companies. Silas Jane was the godfather of the Jane family, according to prosecutor Ron Safer.
Silas Jane was like the Jesse James of the horse industry. He answered to one authority, himself, and the world feared him. He was totally lawless. He operated with no constraints. He murdered people in cold blood, in broad daylight, and was not called to justice for it. He was totally ruthless, and that was the patriarch of the Jane family.
According to investigators, anyone who stood in Jane's way found their barns burned down, their horses killed, and their lives threatened. And as investigators would soon learn, Richard Bailey had deep ties to the horse mafia. The U.S. Attorney's Office in Illinois was investigating conman Richard Bailey, rumored to have been involved in the unsolved case of missing heiress Helen Brock.
Oh, he's got several more.
Authorities learned of Bailey's association with the Jane family, a ruthless group who controlled the equestrian industry in northern Illinois through fear and intimidation.
We knew that Bailey used horses to conduct his swindles. And we knew that somewhere within the horse industry of northern Illinois, people would have knowledge about Helen Brock. So our strategy was simple and straightforward. We were going to subject this industry to law enforcement scrutiny, the likes of which it had never seen. You know, it was used to dealing with county sheriffs and local police, and they beat them every time. The bad guys beat them every time. But now, for the first time, they were going to deal with the Department of Justice, the FBI, the ATF, and the IRS.
A recent victim of one of Richard Bailey's scams was helping the U.S. Attorney's Office open their investigation. Barbara Morris allowed federal agents to record her phone conversations with Bailey. The first step in gathering evidence to prove Bailey was a major player in a criminal enterprise that spanned decades. Agents pored over the case files of the original Brock investigation, looking for new leads. She was last seen at the famed Mayo Clinic in Minnesota.
Review your charts and your files and talking to people you've seen the last couple.
It was February 17th, 1977. She had just undergone a physical and received a good report.
Nothing in here to worry about.
Documents show she checked out of her hotel room with tickets for a flight to O'Hare Airport, returning to her home in the Chicago suburbs of Glenview, Illinois. Her plans were to spend the weekend there and then fly on to Fort Lauderdale, where she had recently bought a condominium. Credit card records show she stopped in a gift shop near the hotel just as it opened at 9 a.m. This was the last verified sighting of Helen Brock.
She disappeared, dropped off the face of the earth. Where was she? So they investigated that. Did she actually get on the plane from the Mayo Clinic to Chicago? She was then supposed to go down to Florida. Did she go down to Florida? That was the first focus of the investigation. Where is she?
There was no record of Helen buying a seat or checking luggage on any flight to Florida. Sometime later, the luggage she packed for the Mayo Clinic was found at her house. Glenview police searched it and tested it for blood and fingerprints. They found no sign of foul play. Police interviewed Richard Bailey early in the investigation. They asked him about his relationship with Helen, and he said they were merely acquaintances.
In 1977, Glenview went to him and they said, "Did you have any business dealings with Helen Brock?" Richard Bailey understood that those business dealings would provide a motive, so he denied having business dealings with her. He hid the horses that he could hide from law enforcement with which he was involved with Helen Brock.
But when the U.S. Attorney's investigation began 13 years later, in 1989, they concentrated on the pattern of behavior reported by Bailey's victims.
How are we all doing?
A picture began to emerge of a sophisticated con artist.
Just get an update how we're doing on the status of the investigation.
The investigation found Bailey would be tipped off to potential victims by stable owners who were always on the lookout for widowed or divorced women. Bailey would meet them, charm them, and start a whirlwind courtship.
Then one night, for example, on the way home from dinner, he'd say, "Let's stop by the stables for a minute because there's this horse that I'm looking into." Well, he had his band of Confederates having set the trap, and they're waiting there. He'd have the vet who had doped this lame horse to make it look like a champion. And there is a trainer who will say, "Oh yes, this is a phenomenal horse. It's being sold for $100,000, but it's worth $500,000.
You look good on it.
You look like a natural.
And then he would say, "Let's go halves."
You all right, that horse?
Okay, that's great. That sounds good. You got a good buy.
Bailey would write a check, and so would the victim.
And when the woman left, they tore up Bailey's check and they raced to the bank
Thank you.
to split up her check.
Here you go. Pigeon has been plucked.
Shortly thereafter, the relationship would sour, and the woman would be stuck paying feed and veterinary bills for a substandard horse. But to reveal the connection between Bailey and Helen Brock, investigators would have to break into the equestrian world. And in Chicago, at that time, it was a world rarely open to law enforcement. A world where people kept silent about criminal activity. Federal prosecutor Steve Miller says fear is what kept people quiet.
People in the horse industry were terrified, and they didn't believe law enforcement could get anything done. They were terrified because stables would burn down in the dead of night if the owners or people boarding their horses were suspected of cooperating with law enforcement. Their horses would be found dead in a stall. One of Bailey's victims, Carol Karstensen, had her house bombed, and she was threatened with the death of her children if she cooperated and didn't back off when she tried to sue them. So there was a tremendous amount of fear.
For the first 2 years of the investigation, leads came slowly. Then they got a tip that would break the equestrian industry wide open. Someone named Tommy the Sandman Burns had been hired to kill a horse in Florida for the insurance money. FBI agent Pete Cullen says he was nicknamed the Sandman because wherever he went, horses were put to sleep.
People knew if Tommy Burns showed up at a horse show, either one or two things was going to happen. Either saddles would be stolen or horses would be killed.
Investigators watched Burns until they caught him breaking a horse's leg.
Oh, stop right there.
After the horse was euthanized, they made their arrest for insurance fraud. The next day, Steve Miller and FBI agent Pete Cullen boarded a plane for Florida and a confrontation with Tommy Burns. Crammed into a cell with the investigators, Burns was questioned about Helen Brock, but denied knowing anything about her.
But then Burns blurted out, "But I've killed show horses for half the famous people in the industry."
Burns was a horse hitman. He admitted to killing 20 horses in his career, making them look like natural deaths so their owners could collect the insurance money. The news of the Sandman's arrest opened a door into the dark underworld of the Chicago show horse circuit that would dramatically affect the investigation.
But it had this sea change effect on the psyche of the people we were investigating. And after Tommy Burns' arrest, when we knocked on people's doors who we believed had committed crimes, whereas before his arrest, they'd slam the door in our face, after the arrest, they'd literally start confessing. We know the gig is up. We want to try to cooperate so that we can do less jail time.
He's kind of a horse wheeler.
The team re-interviewed stable hands, who now admitted Bailey called Helen Mrs. Golden Goose and confirmed that Helen bought horses on Bailey's advice. IRS agents had to track purchases back 20 years and found she spent over $400,000 buying and supporting 9 show horses that failed in competition. A few of the people arrested for insurance fraud were willing to tell investigators what they knew about the mysterious disappearance of Helen Brock. One of those was a con artist who had been arrested in California, Joe Plemons. FBI agent Pete Cullen says that Plemons was one of the most crucial witnesses to the Brock investigation.
Joe Plemons would defraud people. According to his own admission, he was not a killer, but Richard Bailey asked him if he would take care of Mrs. Brock for $10,000.
Go ahead and tell me what you know.
Joe Plemons told investigators Bailey made the proposal over lunch to him and his friend Ken Hansen.
He went to them and he said he had gone too far with the candy lady, that she had found out what he had done, that she was furious, and that she was going to the authorities, and that he needed her to disappear. So he pitched these men to kill her, but they wanted no part of it because Helen Brock, the socialite, the influential, powerful woman, was simply too much heat for them to take on. And they weren't about to get themselves involved in a conspiracy to murder this woman. It would be too dangerous.
The investigators also found people who had heard that Helen Brock was going to go to the authorities. Bailey knew if the wealthy heiress was about to turn him over to authorities, it would be the end of not just his career, but of the Jane gang, who he greatly feared. Helen Brock had to go, and one of the first things Bailey did was to make sure he had an alibi for the weekend Helen Brock disappeared.
Bailey tried to carefully craft an alibi. He knew when she was going to the Mayo Clinic, and he knew when she was coming back. So he arranged to fly to Florida and create a very careful record that he was in Florida during the period that she was reported to have disappeared.
Bailey produced Florida hotel records, restaurant receipts, and an eyewitness, all to prove he was on a romantic oceanside weekend with a young real estate agent from Chicago. A year and a half after Helen's disappearance, a discovery was made in a wooded area outside Chicago.
Been here long?
Yeah, it looks like
The mummified body of a middle-aged woman with red hair was found in a park near Calumet City, south of Chicago. Records show the woman's clothes were in Helen's favorite colors, pink and purple, the colors of the Brock candy logo.
Go ahead and roll the corner there.
A bizarre event in the chain of evidence would preclude any identification. When the doctor at the Cook County morgue was about to begin the autopsy the next day, he discovered that the head was missing. The only record of the head was a few photographs taken at the crime scene. In the jaw, investigators could see posts that might have been consistent with Helen Brock's dental work. But without the head, the medical examiner could not positively identify the body. Over a decade later, investigators believed the body might still yield clues and decided to have it exhumed.
Roughly in the fall, late fall of 1990, we exhumed a body in a pauper's grave in Chicago, Illinois. That body had been found about a year after the disappearance of Mrs. Brock, and there was some speculation that that body could possibly have been her. That's all it was at that point in time. It was just pretty much speculation. The evidence did not bear out that it was, in fact, Mrs. Brock.
There were also no DNA samples of Helen Brock to match with the unknown woman. Helen had no children and no existing blood samples. 2 years after Helen Brock's disappearance, Richard Bailey's name surfaced again. In 1979, 2 young boys on their way to school found graffiti along a road near Helen's estate. In red paint, it said, "Richard Bailey knows where Mrs. Brock's body is. Stop him, please." But prosecutors would need more than accusations scrawled on cement to bring Bailey to justice. The confessions of a horse hitman opened up the corrupt world of competitive show horses for federal prosecutors in Illinois. Armed with inside information, they were able to force other players to confess their illegal activities. And more importantly, to reveal what they knew about a charismatic con man named Richard Bailey and his connection to the missing heiress, Helen Brock.
Richard Bailey had done to Helen Brock what he had done to countless other women. He had swept her off her feet after the love of her life was no longer in the picture. He impressed her with his wealth. He got her involved in horses. And Helen Brock found out that she had been swindled, just like many of these other women. The difference was Helen Brock could bring these people down.
Safer's investigators were able to track purchases that indicated Helen had invested about $400,000 in a group of horses sold to her as valuable champions. When she later found out they were lame and worthless in the competitive ring, investigators learned she told a friend she was furious and planned on reporting Bailey to authorities. She said she would talk to a DA after she returned from her checkup at the Mayo Clinic. But after leaving the clinic, she was never seen again.
Helen Brock was the one person of the dozens of people that he had swindled over the years that he was afraid of, because she alone would have had the power to ramp up a serious, meaningful criminal investigation, which would have led to his conviction.
Bailey had a lot to lose. The profits from conning rich women allowed him to live the life of a wealthy playboy. A condo on Chicago's Lakeshore Drive, a stable in the suburbs, expensive cars and fine restaurants.
Why is it that that murder was committed? There was really only one answer, and that was for Richard Bailey and his band of thieves to keep their thefts going.
The godfather of the horse mafia, Silas Jane, passed away in 1987. And his son, Frank Jane Jr., took over where Silas left off. Prosecutors found a witness that claimed to have overheard Bailey and Frank Jane Jr. talking about Helen Brock shortly before her disappearance. She says she heard them saying that they had to get rid of Bailey's candy lady because she knew too much. That witness was Frank's daughter, Kathy Jane Olson. Prosecutors brought her in for an interview. and she told them her story. She agreed to testify for the prosecution against Richard Bailey, though she did admit she too was involved in various horse scams, helping her father drug horses before selling them to naive investors. After a 5-year investigation, prosecutors indicted 23 people. They held a press conference on July 27, 1994, to announce the explosive charges: mail fraud, wire fraud, and insurance fraud. The indictments included some of the most famous trainers and owners in the equestrian industry. One of those indicted was Richard Bailey. Bailey was arrested and charged with racketeering under the Racketeering and Corrupt Organizations Act, better known as RICO. Miller argued that the people helping Bailey with his cons made up a criminal organization whose goal was to defraud buyers. The murder of Helen Brock was also a part of this RICO indictment. Prosecutors were confident they could prove that Bailey had Brock killed in order to protect his lucrative criminal organization. Even though Bailey was arrested, the murder indictment would be a difficult charge to prove.
I thought it would be incredibly difficult to prosecute somebody for procuring the murder of someone without a body, without really a compelling eyewitness to the murder, without physical evidence, without forensic evidence. I knew it would be an extremely difficult task.
Richard Bailey, now 65 years old, was confident as always. He told his lawyers he would plead guilty to the charges of defrauding women, but he denied having anything to do with the death of Helen Brock. His lawyers gambled on a partial plea, which meant his case would not go before a jury, but to a single judge in a federal sentencing hearing.
The shrewdest legal maneuver in this case was to have Richard Bailey plead guilty to the RICO charge and thus take this away from a jury.
Prosecutors would have to prove the one thing they started off trying to establish: that Helen Brock's relationship to the charismatic con man had been a fatal one. It was the world of beautiful horses, prosecutors say, that drew heiress Helen Brock into what would be her untimely death. A handsome and charming con man named Richard Bailey was the man they alleged had the most compelling reason to make her disappear. Prosecutors were now in court to try and prove that Bailey ordered the death of Helen Brock.
Mr. Bailey, please rise.
Bailey confessed that he had defrauded some 20 women, so the forum would not be a jury trial, but a sentencing hearing in front of a single federal judge.
16 of the 26 counts.
Judge Milton Shader, a highly respected federal judge known for his even-handedness, presided.
Do you understand that?
Yes, Your Honor.
By pleading guilty to most of the RICO charges, Bailey's lawyers thought he might receive a prison term as short as 27 months. But before passing the final sentence, Judge Shader advised Bailey he would carefully consider all the government's evidence relating to Brock's death.
Yes.
Thank you, Your Honor.
Bailey's defense team admitted their client used women, but said there was no proof he ever physically harmed anyone.
The defense's argument was simple. Yes, Richard Bailey is a con man. Yes, he's a cad. Yes, he did almost everything that the government says he did. But he wasn't a violent man. He didn't harm these other women. Why would he harm Helen Brock?
As the women conned by Bailey sat in the courtroom, U.S. Attorney Steve Miller called Joe Plemons to the stand. Plemons was a con man who was also involved in the fraudulent sales of horses.
Kenny's your associate?
He testified for the government about the day Bailey asked him and his friend Ken Hansen to kill Helen Brock.
Well, we were in a meeting in a restaurant.
According to Plemons' testimony, at the restaurant, Bailey told them that he thought that Helen Brock was about to go to the authorities and offered them $10,000 to murder her.
Now, the problem was, he said that this was shortly before her disappearance, but also that it was a warm day, that they were walking around without jackets. And we grilled him on that because we knew she disappeared in February and there are precious few warm days. But he was steadfast. He said, you know, I can only tell you the truth. And the truth is, it was a warm day and it was shortly before her disappearance. Well, as a final act to test what Plemons was telling us, we went back and we looked at the Weather Service charts, and we found out, lo and behold, that about a week before Helen Brock disappeared, there was miraculously a 60-degree day in Chicago in February.
About the quality of horses.
But Bailey's attorney presented Plemons as a professional liar, getting Plemons to admit that when it came to horses, his word on their value was always a lie.
Your word is worthless, in a sense.
Yes, I'm sorry to say.
And really, when it comes to this meeting with Mr. Bailey, all we have to go on is your word.
Yes, that's true.
There's no question that some of the witnesses that we called in our case were of dubious character. They were Confederates of Richard Bailey's. You know, conspiracies hatched in hell do not have angels as witnesses.
Another of the government's witnesses, Kathy Jane Olson, was also no angel. She admitted to being involved in various horse scams, including drugging horses to be sold to naive investors. And she was also a recovering drug addict. She recounted hearing her father, Frank Jane Jr., talking about the Helen Brock problem. On cross-examination, Olson admitted to abusing crack, marijuana, and alcohol in the past. The defense argued that Olson's memory was clouded with those drugs. Judge Shader agreed, stating he could not trust her testimony.
I have no further questions.
Finally, it was time for Richard Bailey to tell his story. He was a mixture of smooth charm and rough edges. Prosecutors say he had little formal education. In fact, he could hardly read or write. But he was a genius at meeting women.
Mr. Bailey, can you please tell me how you...
He admitted targeting the wealthy and vulnerable, gaining their trust with romance and taking their money. But Richard Bailey denied he ever swindled Helen Brock. He said their relationship was friendly and businesslike, and he cultivated that relationship because she had a lot of money.
She had a friend she'd like me to meet. So I said, who's the friend? She says, Helen Brock.
Richard Bailey?
He told the court that he met Helen through a mutual friend, and that they hit it off immediately.
Oh, no, this part is purely...
According to Bailey, Helen enjoyed the attention and the company. She was a lonely woman living by herself, by now a widow for 7 years. Bailey told the court that he and Helen were at a Florida racetrack when she, not Bailey, brought up the subject of buying a few racehorses. Bailey says he never personally sold her any horses. Instead, he arranged for his brother to sell her 3 racehorses. Unbeknownst to Helen, they were bought at auction for a total of $20,000. Bailey admitted he pocketed half of the $80,000 profit. When the overpriced horses didn't win any races, Bailey said he suggested to Helen that she retrain them for the show horse circuit and make her money back in champion stud fees. By late 1976, Bailey explained, his relationship with Helen remained platonic. But they both enjoyed going out dancing. Bailey was frank about his desire for her money. He said Helen was worth more to him alive than dead.
Absolutely not. It just doesn't make sense. I was planning to stay with her for a long time. She had a long bankroll, $30 million.
He insisted he had no reason to believe she was going to report him to the authorities.
So you had nothing to do with the
Bailey remained cool and confident. It would be Ron Safer's job to expose his lies for the judge.
For me, the most difficult aspect of the trial was cross-examining Richard Bailey. Here was a man who made his living, spent his entire life lying successfully, and I had to reveal him in a matter of hours as the con man and the liar that he was.
And Safer saw his chance in a remark made earlier.
At the beginning of 1977, you had a number of lawsuits pending, didn't you?
Bailey had set up an alibi for himself. When Helen Brock disappeared, Richard Bailey had arranged to be down in Florida with someone else. So he had set up that alibi. But a wonderful thing happened. Richard Bailey heard the testimony of Joe Plemons. He sat there in court and he heard that Plemons testified that Bailey had solicited him a week before the murder to kill Helen Brock. So a bright idea went off in Richard Bailey's head. And he said, I have receipts for the Florida hotel during the time that Helen Brock disappeared, February 17th. But you know what? I was down in Florida for 10 days before that. So I couldn't have solicited Plemons.
It was on the record. Bailey, under oath, denied even being in Illinois during the time that the alleged meeting took place.
When I cross-examined him, I locked him into that alibi. He said, oh, I distinctly remember being in Florida. I played tennis, I met with such and such on the week before Brock disappeared. Well, I knew, of course, that we had telephone records from his condominium on Lakeshore Drive, which established that he was there making calls to his friends, his Confederates, from his apartment during the time that he was now claiming to be in Florida.
That's when Safer knew he had him. The prosecutor presented phone records from Bailey's condo in Chicago, showing many calls to his associates going in and out that same week. Bailey claimed someone else must have made the calls and stepped down. But the damage was done.
Closing arguments, if you're ready.
The prosecution showed that Bailey had lied on the stand. In his defense, Bailey's lawyers brought up other suspects they said had more motive and criminal history than Bailey. People like Brock's chauffeur, or even the Jane family, members of the Chicago horse mafia. But the prosecutors countered that Bailey was nevertheless at the center of the conspiracy.
Our investigation focused on who obtained this murder. The person that committed this murder was all but irrelevant to us. They were the bullet in the gun. Richard Bailey took that gun, and he aimed that gun, and he fired that gun. What bullet he chose was practically irrelevant to us.
In a federal sentencing hearing, the accused is allowed the last word to the judge, and Bailey used this opportunity to again declare his innocence.
I'd just like to say that I had nothing whatsoever to do with Helen Brock's disappearance. If I knew anything, I would have told you, because I wouldn't have had to sit in jail all this time. I know if I brought forth truthful information, there's a good possibility that my sentence could be reduced for the charges that I have pled
When
guilty.
Bailey asked for leniency, so he could spend some of his remaining years with a woman he recently married, Miller jumped to his feet and reminded the judge of the lack of mercy Bailey showed all the women caught in his swindles.
Well, Bailey dug an even deeper hole for himself. He was simply trying to con his way out of a conviction.
On June 15, 1995, 18 years after Helen Brock's disappearance, Judge Shader returned to the courtroom ready to pronounce his sentence. With his next words, he would announce whether Richard Bailey was just a con man or a killer. On June 15th, 1995, this federal courtroom in Chicago was packed with Richard Bailey's victims and the press,
All rise.
all waiting to hear the decision in one of the most highly publicized murder mysteries in Chicago's history. It was a sentencing hearing. A partial plea to fraud was already accepted. But Bailey's guilt on the remaining charge of conspiracy to commit the murder of candy heiress Helen Brock would be decided by one man only.
Defendant, please rise.
Judge Milton Shader.
I don't believe that you, Mr. Bailey, thought Helen Brock was too...
Judge Shader, even-handed to the letter during the trial, finally revealed his fury.
Wow. That you developed.
He said con man Richard Bailey tried to con him as well, when the defendant claimed Helen was his golden goose and he would never kill her.
This court does therefore sentence
The
you,
judge
Mr. Bailey,
pronounced Bailey guilty of conspiring to kill Helen Brock
prison, being a federal court,
and sentenced him to 30 years in prison without parole.
bailiff, would you escort Mr. Bailey?
Essentially a life sentence for the 65-year-old defendant. It had taken the resources of the Department of Justice, but Helen Brock's death was finally avenged.
This court is adjourned.
It was an honor to be part of this investigation, to achieve results beyond which we ever dreamed, to not only solve the Helen Brock murder in the only meaningful way, which is the people that plotted her murder, and to penetrate an industry of corruption and reveal them for what they were, is a once-in-a-lifetime experience.
Over the course of the U.S. Attorney's investigation, many leads to the location of Helen Brock's body were followed.
Whether she is buried under a cement fireplace that was put up in Bailey's stables right after she disappeared, whether her body was burned in an incinerator that fired up shortly after she disappeared at Frank Jane's stables, whether she was in some field. There are a million theories.
But no trace of the candy company Heiress has ever been found.
If we dug a hole in every location where people called us up claiming to know the whereabouts of Helen Brock, Chicago would look like the moon.
It is a different unanswered question that still haunts Steve Miller.
There is one aspect of this case which is yet to be completed, and that is who actually pulled the trigger, thrust the knife, or killed her. We don't know. What we know is that Richard Bailey was the one who set it up and caused it to happen.
Some investigators believe that Bailey is simply more afraid of retribution if he fingered members of the Jane family than he is of life in prison. And because of that, Bailey will never tell prosecutors what he really knows. When she was alive, one of Helen's favorite places was the family burial grounds in Ohio, a giant edifice containing her beloved parents, husband, and 2 pet dogs. Her own carefully designed crypt lays empty, but the headstone is marked with these words. It was spring of 1988 at a riding stable in suburban Chicago. Barbara Morris, a wealthy widow, was beginning to realize something was terribly wrong with her new horse. Despite expensive training in the show ring, the horse still refused to jump. Her temper was rising as she began to realize that if this $50,000 animal couldn't compete in the ring, it was worthless to her. She had purchased the horse as an investment on the recommendation of her boyfriend, Richard Bailey. What Barbara Morris didn't know was that most of the women who dated Bailey over the past 15 years had also invested hundreds of thousands of dollars on flawed horses. According to former Assistant U.S. Attorney Ron Safer,
Richard Bailey was a predator of women. What Richard Bailey did was, with his band of thieves, Confederates, they would, at a stables, locate a rich, lonely woman who, and they identified her, they scoped her out, they looked at her house, they looked at her car, and then when they would determine that that was a ripe victim, they sprung the trap.
the next day, Barbara Morris went to the stable, clutching a handful of bills for her expensive horse's inflated upkeep. The stable owner was nowhere to be found, but had been cold for over a decade. Given the chance to solve a 13-year mystery, Miller looked into the case. But he knew to solve it, he would have to run an unorthodox murder investigation. One that followed not forensics, but fraud.
Because Richard Bailey had no criminal record, I decided to play a hunch. I'd been told the rumors were he was a professional con man.
Miller sent his team of federal agents to the county courthouses surrounding Chicago to see if Bailey had ever been sued.
The agents really excitedly came back to me, telling me that Richard Bailey had been sued over a 20-year period by many, many women. One a mirror image of the next, detailing fraud after fraud after fraud by Richard Bailey.
But the stacks of civil cases were not enough to start an investigation. They would need a current case and a criminal act. Bailey's latest victim, Barbara Morris, agreed to let prosecutors record her phone conversations with him. This time, he tried to get her to write a check for $100,000 to buy a flawed stallion named Victory Morn. According to investigators, Bailey's fraudulent statements on the phone allowed authorities to open the investigation. Prosecutors needed to understand Bailey's whole criminal enterprise, and they wanted to get solid information on Bailey's connection to the late Helen Brock. When she received no help from the stable employees, it dawned on her that she might be the victim of a scam.
The trap involved a whole panoply of players. It involved a trainer who could say, this horse is an exceptional horse. You should really purchase this horse. It involved a veterinarian who drugged the horse to make a lame horse appear like a show champion. It involved stable owners. And of course, the center of this scheme was Richard Bailey.
Look, she got good, solid feet.
Barbara next went to her boyfriend, Richard Bailey.
Barbara, how are you? Good to see you. We're just thinking about you.
She told him of her suspicions that the horse was bad and the stables were crooked. Bailey tried in vain to calm her down and distract her.
I was going to ask you out to dinner. Aren't they lovely?
Finally, though he didn't know it, Barbara came to realize that it was Bailey himself who was conning her.
No, I can't do it.
What Richard Bailey did was he took woman after woman, and he would sweep them off their feet. He would pay a tremendous amount of attention to them. He would send them flowers every day, pick them up in his rented Rolls Royce. They, of course, believed it was his. Take them to the finest restaurants in Chicago and gain their confidence.
Miss Morrison, have a seat.
Barbara Morris went to the local police. They told her it was a case for finishes without a trace. Police follow mysterious clues to the possible kidnapping or murder. But without a prime suspect or a body, the trail soon turns cold. After more than a decade, a United States attorney with a reputation for cracking unsolved crimes uncovers evidence of a violent and secret world and comes face to face with an elusive criminal. In the fall of 1989, Chicago-based U.S. Attorney Stephen Miller and his team of prosecutors recruited investigators from 3 federal agencies and launched a groundbreaking investigation into the mysterious disappearance of Helen Brock.
She was the wealthiest woman in Illinois. In 1977, when she disappeared, her net worth was estimated north of $40 million. She was very prominent. She was a socialite. She was a philanthropist. She had friends in high places. And typically, people like that don't simply vanish. And at least in the early years after her disappearance, there was enormous law enforcement efforts trying to find out what happened. And the fact that they were unable to do so led to the mystery growing and growing and growing.
Civil courts, because a fraudulent horse sale was hard to prove in the criminal system. But one state investigator who had watched Bailey for years was interested. And he took her case to the U.S. Attorney's Office and presented it to the Chief of Special Prosecutions, Steve Miller.
I was told that the man suspected of stealing the $50,000 from this woman was rumored to be a professional con man, and that he had supposedly bilked many people over the years out of money involving transactions with horses. That piqued my curiosity. They also told me that Bailey, the suspect, had been rumored to have dated Helen Brock.
Helen Brock was the richest widow in the state of Illinois 11 years before, in 1977. She had assets of over $30 million. Helen Brock had lived with her husband Frank in a large house in suburban Glenview, and they were happily married for over 20 years, until Frank died in 1970. Their fortune came from Frank's ownership of the Brock Candy Company. He had even used Helen's favorite colors, pink and purple, on the signature candy boxes. In 1977, she was reported missing and never seen or heard from again. 7 years later, in 1984, she was declared legally dead. Her disappearance became one of the biggest mysteries in Chicago, the subject of much rumor and folklore, but very little fact. Her case was officially opened,